Good morning. I would first like to recognize Beth Gates Warren, the co author of Julian Levy, The Man, His Gallery, His Legacy, and acknowledge her invaluable contribution to our 15-year project to document the story of Julian and his gallery. My talk today may seem somewhat like a speed dating session with Julian Levy as I attempt to tell you about his life, his legacy, and the women artists he championed in a short period of time. Julian Sampson Levy was born in New York City on January 22nd, 1906, to Edgar and Isabel Isaacs Levy. Julian's father was a successful real estate developer, so Julian and his siblings grew up with all the comforts of a lavish lifestyle. Despite his very average grades, the age of 17, Julian was accepted to Harvard. The faculty there was especially illustrious during the years Julian was in residence, and there were also several students, later dubbed the Harvard Modernists, who would play important roles in Julian's life, even though their years at Harvard did not entirely coincide with his. In the spring of 1926, Julian became bored with his academic life, abruptly withdrew from Harvard, and moved back to Manhattan to pursue a career in filmmaking. In October of that year, Julian struck up a friendship with Marcel Duchamp, who had recently arrived in New York for the sale of John Quinn's collection of Brancusi sculpture at the Brummer Gallery. Although Marcel was almost 2 decades older than Julian, the two got on well together, especially after Duchamp discovered his young friend's interest in making avant garde films. Marcel was also impressed when Julian succeeded in convincing his father to pay $1,000 for Brancusi's white marble version of Bird in Space. Duchamp, who Levy would later claim as one of his adopted godfathers, invited Levy to accompany him on his return trip to France. And on February 26, 1927, they sailed out of New York Harbor on the SS Paris. Also on board was the writer and publisher Robert McAlmon, and he and Julian soon became friends. Shortly after their arrival in Paris, McAlmon invited Julian to a party at Peggy Guggenheim's apartment. That evening, Julian found himself in the company of Hemingway, Ezra Pound, Jean Cocteau, along with other well known individuals who frequented her salon. He also met two women who would change the course of his life. One was the painter and Dadaist poet Mina Loy. The other, her beautiful 19-year-old daughter, Joella. Julian later maintained that just before meeting Joella, he had dreamt about a girl who wore her hair in a style known as snails, with braids coiled over both ears. By June, Julian and Joella were openly declaring their love for each other. And despite misgivings by both Julian's father and Joella's mother, the couple was married in Paris on August 5th, 1927. A few weeks later, the newlyweds, accompanied by Julian's father Edgar, sailed for New York City. On July 14th, 1928, Joella gave birth to a baby boy who they named Javen. In the autumn of 1929, after fulfilling a commitment to his father to complete a 2-year stint working in Edgar's real estate development company, Julian applied for a position at the Via Gallery. In December, he started his new job as an assistant to the director, Carl Zagrosser. On March 9th, 1930, Joella and Julian welcomed their second son, Gerald, into the world. In November, Julian organized an exhibition of Eugene Atget photographs at the Via Gallery. But by the end of 1930, he was becoming restless and began mulling over a potential opportunity to fulfill a long-held dream of opening an art gallery. Julian's mother had passed away shortly after the end of his freshman year at Harvard. In her will, she had left the amount of $20,000 to Julian, which he was to inherit on January 22nd, 1931, his 25th birthday. The moment Julian had his inheritance in hand, he resigned from Via, and he and Joella began looking for a rental space to house a gallery of their own. One of the most promising locations was a brownstone at 602 Madison Avenue. The 20 by 50-foot space on the fourth floor was already divided into two rooms that could be used for exhibition galleries, and there was also a tiny office and a compact storage area. Best of all, there was an elevator that provided access from the ground level and a large showcase window by the front entrance that was included in the rent. Julian signed the lease, and during the summer of 1931, he and Joella made a buying trip to Paris. After their arrival, Julian traveled on alone to Berlin to connect with photographers and filmmakers there, while Mina Loy, who knew most of the painters in Paris, helped Joella spread the word about their new gallery. As Julian's plans solidified, he asked Mina to act as his agent in establishing a dependable channel of communication between her artist friends in Paris and his gallery in New York City. Mina took on the role with some trepidation, as she knew that it would require a great deal of organization and attention to detail. But her relationships with the artists were what counted the most, as they knew and trusted Mina, while her son in law was still an unknown quantity. Julian Levy was a visionary who instigated many changes within the American art world. His first move was to announce that his gallery would showcase the work of living artists. That decision alone distinguished him from most other art dealers in the United States in 1931. Years later, Julian spoke about how the gallery operated as a creative force. All the artists, all sorts of people used to come in and use it as a sitting room. They'd cadge liquor, drink sherry with me in the back room, and we'd talk. Everyone would profit from that, exchanging ideas. I'd had a museum director's training from Harvard, but I had to be on my own. Couldn't take orders from my father, from trustees, from anyone. So I was going to have a little museum of my own, a gallery that was more than just a selling place. Even though Joella had lobbied Julian to open the gallery with a survey of European photography, he instead decided to pay homage to the early efforts of Alfred Stieglitz, another man Julian would later call his godfather, by mounting an American photography retrospective. The inaugural show at the Julian Levy Gallery opened on November 2nd, 1931. Julian and Joella were the epitome of chic. The newly refurbished gallery was small but impressive, and the range of American-made photographs on the walls offered a thought-provoking and aesthetically stimulating pictorial history lesson. Julian's press release noted that the gallery plans to present a series of interesting exhibitions of paintings, drawing, and sculpture, but believing it to be high time that photography as an art be given the sanction of a gallery, will in particular devote itself to that medium. Another aspect of the gallery's work will be an intimate cinema projection room where will be shown significant new experiments in the art of cinema. In January 1932, the Julian Levy Gallery was the first to mount an exhibition of surrealism in the United States, and Julian chose to use the French spelling on the cover of the exhibition catalog designed by Joseph Cornell. Included in this landmark show were works by Salvador Dali, Max Ernst, Pablo Picasso, Pierre Roy, Jean Cocteau, Man Ray, and Herbert Bayer, among others. A columnist at Art News opined, "A pleasant madness prevails at Julian Levy's new and interesting gallery. Mr. Levy has been at considerable pains to inform us what these ultra-modern men are up to, and he is to be congratulated on the well-rounded lineup of the surrealistic camp. The critics were impressed by Julian's audacity. He had made his mark early by establishing himself at the age of 26 as the art dealer who brought surrealism to the United States. During 1932, Mina Loy continued to provide a great deal of help from Paris by working directly with artists Salvador Dali, Pavel Telchev, and Eugene Berman, all of whom required a great deal of attention. Joella was also instrumental to the success of the gallery as she was there almost every day, working to install exhibitions, greet the clients, and generally keep the gallery moving forward. While Julien was in Paris on a buying trip in the spring of 1932, Joella informed her husband that she was giving a show to Sandy Calder beginning on the 12th of May. Calder had been in touch with Julien, asking whether he might be interested in showing Calder's new mobiles. Julien had already seen a few examples and was not impressed, so he left the decision up to his wife. Thus, it was Joella, not Julien, who mounted Calder's first show of mobiles in the United States. The year 1936 started on a high note with the birth of the Levy's third son, Jonathan, on March 28. On the gallery schedule were exhibitions by Magritte, de Chirico, Leonore Fini, and Max Ernst, culminating with a blockbuster Dali show in November. And Julien's book Surrealism was to be published in December. However, during a visit to France in June, Julien began a dalliance with Leonore Fini and spent 10 days in Normandy with her before sailing back to the US. Leonore, still infatuated with Julien, mailed packets of love letters to him, which were intercepted by Joella, who was summering in New England with the Levy's three sons. With his marriage on the verge of imploding, Julien began drinking excessively. During the summer of 1937, he indulged in yet another affair, and that November, Julien and Joella signed an informal separation agreement, although their divorce did not become final until 1942. Julien moved his gallery to a larger space at 15 East 57th Street in October 1937. In the summer of 1941, with the threat of war looming over the world, Julien announced his plans to temporarily close his Manhattan gallery and travel to the West Coast, where he would exhibit a selection of paintings by several of the artists he represented, a traveling caravan of modern art. Returning to New York City just after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Julien rented space at Der Locker Brothers, where his friend Kirk Askew was gallery director, and he mounted 7 exhibitions there before reopening the Julien Levy Gallery in March of 1943 at what would be its final location on the 4th floor of a brownstone at 42 East 57th Street. Each of Levy's galleries had a unique appearance. Traditional velvet wall coverings were replaced by sleek white walls, although he painted one room Harvard red in his first gallery and one wall black in his second. Julien also designed a sinuously curved wall in the second gallery space that allowed viewers to ponder one artwork at a time. He believed that his primary role as a gallery owner was to present art well. So he devised a display system that consisted of a double row of decorative molding strips, spaced 2 feet apart and attached to the walls at a comfortable height for viewing. The moldings were grooved top and bottom so that photographs or drawings could be sandwiched between 2 sheets of glass and slipped into the grooves, keeping each artwork securely in place without nails. When Julien exhibited paintings, they were well spaced and hung at eye level instead of being stacked on top of each other, as was often the case at other art galleries. Rather than sending engraved invitations and catalogs to a select few, as was the norm, Julien produced clever, eye-catching exhibition announcements and catalogs that often incorporated designs contributed by the artists themselves, as well as essays by noted art world personalities. Instead of the usual hushed exhibition openings, Julien invented the cocktail vernissage and held noisy parties where the public was always welcome. On occasion, he also supported worthwhile educational and fundraising efforts by offering his gallery as an event venue free of charge. Julien was also the first to exhibit Disney animated celluloids, as well as drawings by comic strip artists and book illustrators, thus laying the groundwork for the pop art movement 3 decades later. In his estimation, high art and low art were of equal importance. Julian's second wife, Muriel Streeter, was born in 1913 in Vineland, New Jersey. In 1932, she began studying painting with Franklin C. Watkins in Philadelphia and worked as an artist's model to earn money. Muriel and Julien met on board the ship that carried Julien to France in 1937 for his final European visit prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. Julien and Muriel began an affair which continued throughout the summer, and this was the final nail in the coffin of Julien and Joella's marriage. After Muriel returned to the United States in the autumn, she and Julien rekindled their relationship, and Muriel moved into his Greenwich Village apartment early in 1938. In March 1944, Julien and Muriel traveled across the Hudson River to Hoboken, New Jersey, where they were married following 6 turbulent years of living together. By the time he was 43, Julien had become disillusioned with the art world. In April of 1949, he closed his gallery, and he and Muriel retired to a farmhouse in Bridgewater, Connecticut. When they too went their separate ways, it was thanks to his third wife, the former Jean Farley McGonigal, that Julien finally succeeded in conquering his addiction to alcohol. Jean Levy was one of the first women to pursue a career in fashion advertising, working as a copywriter for several upscale New York City department stores. In 1955, she was introduced to Julien Levy by mutual friends, and the couple married on January 20th, 1957. With Jean's encouragement and support, Julien enjoyed a highly productive second career, writing his memoir, teaching, and lecturing about surrealism to a whole new generation of students, museum goers, and art collectors. After Julien's death in 1981 at the age of 75, Jean established a foundation in his honor. In June 2001, a major acquisition of photographs from the Levy collection was made by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. After Jean Levy's death in 2003, the art collection was entrusted to the Paris auction house Tijan, who mounted a very successful 3-day sale in October 2004. One of Julien Levy's most noteworthy accomplishments that has long gone unacknowledged was the fact that between November 1931 and mid-April 1949, Julien mounted 30 solo exhibitions for 24 women artists. Levy's willingness to recognize and promote their work becomes even more salient compared to the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition history during those same years, when only 3 women were given solo shows. Today, I want to briefly introduce you to these 24 amazing women, presenting them in the chronological order of their first appearance at the Julien Levy Gallery. When Julien Levy visited Paris in the spring of 1927, he befriended photographer Berenice Abbott and engaged her to take his portrait. Abbott relocated to New York City in 1930, and in September 1932, Levy opened the fall season of his gallery with photographs by Berenice Abbott, her first solo exhibition in the United States. Abbott's documentation of the disappearing buildings and historic byways of New York City prompted critics to compare her images of Gotham to Eugene Atget's photographs of Paris. Elizabeth Miller was born in 1907 in Poughkeepsie, New York. In the late 1920s, she began using the name Lee, a variant of one of her childhood nicknames. likely because it was sexually ambiguous. In 1929, Miller traveled to Paris, where she developed both a personal and a professional relationship with photographer Man Ray. By the spring of 1932, they were no longer together. And when Julien arrived in Paris in May, he wasted no time in taking advantage of Miller's availability. After a summer fling, Levy returned to New York City, determined to mount an exhibition of Miller's work. And on December 30th, 1932, her photographs went on view at the Levy Gallery. The press release proclaimed, "The new light on the horizon of photography is Miss Lee Miller, who went to Paris to study painting, but discovered instead the contemporary medium of photography." Lee Miller's show at the Julian Levy Gallery was her first and only solo exhibition during her lifetime. Throughout her life, Mina Loy identified herself foremost as a painter, but she was also a groundbreaking poet and a writer. She has been labeled as futurist, Dadaist, surrealist, feminist, and modernist. On January 28th, 1933, Julien gave Mina Loy her first painting exhibition in the United States, consisting of 11 works, all of them done in shades of blue that gave them an otherworldly, mystical atmosphere. The blue paper catalog cover featured a simple line drawing of two faces, four upraised hands, and four stars, all simplified versions of elements that appeared in Mina's paintings. In December of 1936, Mina Loy finally succumbed to her fears about war breaking out and fled Paris for the safety of New York City. Helene Sardou's sculpture exhibition opened at the Levy Gallery in February of 1934. A native of Belgium, Sardou's showing consisted of more than 45 works in 6 different mediums. Frank Crowninshield, the legendary Condé Nast editor, wrote a laudatory essay for the exhibition brochure, which was printed on vivid pink paper stock and mailed to gallery goers in a matching pink envelope. In 1923, photographer Martha Wynne Richards dropped her given name and became known simply as Wynne Richards. She was best known for her portraits of fashionable women, so it is not surprising that her Levy Gallery showing in April of 1934 was titled Photographs of Women Prominent in Fashion. Alice Hughes at the New York American noted, "These 48 images are photos of women who have muscled their way into men's fields and established themselves as authorities to be reckoned with. They are powerful, sure of themselves, intelligent. Many are at the top of their success." Cora Elizabeth Berry, ending with a Y, was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1898. But according to her Levy Gallery press release, Corinna de Berry, ending with an I, was born 10 years later in 1908 in Nice, France. De Berry also claimed to have been married to an Italian count, giving her the right to use the title Countess. The auburn-haired beauty would continue freely embellishing her past for the rest of her life. DeBerry's show opened in November 1934, and many of the paintings on view had been completed during a summer DeBerry spent in Rockport, Massachusetts, with Italian-born sculptor Antonio Salemme. The reviewers were generally kind in their comments, especially the male critics who were entranced by her. By the time Leonore Feeney and Julien Levy met in Paris in June 1936, she had participated in several group exhibitions all over Europe, and word of her success as a portraitist had spread. Also known for her outrageous behavior, Feeney fully lived up to her reputation and Julien's expectations. He would later describe her as a woman whose parts did not fit well together. Head of a lioness, mind of a man, bust of a woman, torso of a child, grace of an angel, and discourse of the devil. Despite the strain on Levy's marriage caused by his recent summer affair with Feeney, Julian proceeded to make plans to show her work concurrently with Max Ernst's in November 1936. Feeney made the voyage from France to be present for her first solo exhibition in the US. Titled simply Leonore Feeney Paintings, her exhibition catalog included contributions from poet Paul Alloy and painter Giorgio de Chirico. Julian gave Feeney a second show in February 1939. The 14 paintings on view were earthy, provocative, and sometimes humorous. Art News reported that her craftsmanship is fine, her patterns sometimes delightful, and her ability as a portraitist is unquestionably excellent. Julian Levy showed Alice Halika's work in early February 1938, perhaps at the urging of her friend, the neo-romantic artist Leonid Berman. Halika's exhibition of paintings and romance capitonnée focused on a group of 20 collages from her Quilted Romances series. One of the collages in the show was lent by Catherine Dreyer and subsequently gifted to the Yale University Art Gallery, where it remains today. Arabian Nights is meticulously crafted using the trapunto quilting technique to give the tableau three-dimensionality, incorporating swatches of patterned silks and satins and cuttings of human hair coaxed into miniature coiffures. Florence Kane was already a well-respected art educator when her exhibition opened at the Levy Gallery on February 9, 1938. The majority of the 21 oil paintings on display had been painted during her recent travels to Mexico and Guatemala, and Levy was successful in selling 7 of Kane's paintings. On September 26, 1938, paintings by Gracie Allen, radio star and wife of comedian George Burns, opened at the Levy Gallery. Julian touted Gracie's purported artistic skills, calling her a mad Michelangelo with the mind of a surrealist. Allen played her role to the hilt, titling her paintings with nonsensical phrases such as, "Man with Mike Fright moons over a manicurist." It was all a lighthearted farce concocted for publicity's sake to raise money for medical aid to Chinese refugees. 9 months later, the story reached an entirely new level of absurdity when an article in an Athens, Ohio newspaper revealed that the paintings exhibited by Levy and promoted as Gracie Allen's handiwork had been created by a very broke Hollywood artist who was paid $5 per painting by Allen's crafty publicity agent. Of all the artists Julian Levy represented, Frida Kahlo seems to have been the one he most admired. Surprisingly, very few of the voluminous books and articles written about Kahlo emphasize just how important her exhibition at the Levy Gallery was in building her reputation as an artist. Given how famous she is today, it is difficult to believe that Levy mounted her first and only solo exhibition in the United States during her lifetime. Kahlo and Levy began corresponding near the end of 1937, and Levy decided to show her work at his gallery. At his request, Kahlo sent a brief summary of her life, telling him, "I never had any exhibition before. I was always shy and afraid to show my things. I never knew I was a surrealist until Andre Breton came to Mexico and told me I was one. I myself still don't know what I am. The only thing I know is that I paint because I need to." Kahlo's show opened on November 1st, 1938, and Breton contributed an introduction to the catalog in which he called her paintings pure surreality and described her art as resembling a ribbon around a bomb. The response to her work was phenomenal, with virtually every New York City critic covering the event. Kahlo was on hand throughout the exhibition, dressed in her colorful Tehuantepec garb and with her long black hair braided and entwined with ribbons. Levy was mesmerized by Kahlo, and during her time in New York City, they began an affair. Levy photographed her in his Greenwich Village apartment, nude from the waist up, while she arranged her coiffure in a choreographed ritual he later described as a fantastic liturgy. After her return to Mexico, Kahlo and Levy continued to correspond until 1947. Beth and I are delighted to announce that we've been able to include both sides of their previously unpublished correspondence in our book. It makes for fascinating reading. Maud Cabot Morgan, a descendant of the Boston Cabots, had her first solo exhibition at the Julien Levy Gallery in mid November 1938. Likely due to Morgan's family connections, almost every newspaper and art journal covered the opening, and the show garnered excellent reviews. In October 1942, Julian gave Morgan a second exhibition, and among the 20 paintings on display was Musical Squash, which was acquired by Morgan's friend, Mrs. Nathan Todd Porter, for $200 and subsequently donated to the Museum of Modern Art. The exhibition, Marila Lednica Sculpture, opened at the Levy Gallery at the end of November 1938. After her exhibition, the Polish sculptress was commissioned to create works for two churches in New Jersey, and her limestone statue of St. Anthony of Padua still stands near a brook behind St. Bridget Catholic Church in Peapack. After learning that General Franco was on the verge of installing his fascist regime, Ione Robinson wrote, "If I were a man, I would volunteer as a soldier and fight for the Spanish Republic. Being a woman and an artist, I feel that what I should do is draw." In September 1938, Robinson traveled to Barcelona. Finding the city in ruins and food supplies virtually non existent, she began sketching in orphanages and hospitals. In early November, she flew to Berlin, just in time to witness the Nazis unleash a wave of violence in Germany. After returning to the US, Robinson was repeatedly asked by the press to give eyewitness accounts of the recent atrocities she had seen. And this may have prompted Julian Levy to offer 28-year-old Robinson her first solo exhibition in New York City. The show opened on December 9th, 1938, and on display were 30 of Robinson's drawings and paintings depicting the plight of those widowed and orphaned by the Spanish Civil War. A reporter for the New York Times found them extremely effective, writing, "It is tremendously sympathetic work by an artist with a true flair for the medium." Although Irene Rice Pereira and her husband were divorced, she continued to use his surname and the initial of her first name in signing her paintings, possibly to hide the fact that a woman had created them. Paintings and collages by I. Rice Pereira went on display at the Levy Gallery in February 1939. The orange-hued cover of the exhibition catalog included simple graphics that were a reference to the geometry of her paintings. Inside was a listing of the 15 canvases that were on display, including Pereira's curves and angles, which was also exhibited in 1940 at the New York World's Fair. Born in what is now Serbia, Milena Pavlovic Barili, known professionally only by her first name, was a distant cousin of King Alexander I of Yugoslavia. During the summer of 1939, Milena decided to travel to the United States, and sometime after arriving in New York, she met Julian Levy, who offered her a solo exhibition. Levy prepared a press release touting Milena's patrician background and informing viewers that although this was her first American exhibition, she had already shown her work in various European cities. Her show went on view at the Levy Gallery in March 1940, and those reviewing her exhibition were much impressed by the tall, striking young woman with the regal bearing. They were also quite taken with her paintings, in which she melded a curious mix of precise Renaissance style technique and settings with dreamy, mystical subject matter. By the time Tamara de Lempicka's exhibition opened in April 1941, she had already achieved considerable fame. But Levy was not prepared for the paintings she chose to exhibit at his gallery. Instead of the glamorous paintings of famous French personalities that led to her previous notoriety, she displayed touching likenesses of humble peasants and religious figures. The catalog cover featured her painting Wisdom, and at the opening night cocktail party, the artist took the opportunity to be photographed standing in front of her Mother Superior painting with Dali at her side. While no one faulted Lempicka's technical prowess, one critic did compare the overly dramatic spotlighting of the paintings within the darkened gallery to a secular cathedral. English-born Catherine Yarrow fled to New York City during the Second World War. In May 1943, her first solo exhibition, Ceramics by Catherine Yarrow, was on view at the Levy Gallery in conjunction with a show of bird-related collages and drawings by Max Ernst. Art News proclaimed it was Bird Month at the Julien Levy Gallery and described Yarrow's work as distinguished pottery handsomely decorated with fanciful bird abstractions. In the autumn of 1943, Xenia Cage began seeing a psychiatrist to help her adjust to her inevitable divorce from avant-garde composer John Cage. And during this period, she began to craft rather delicate mobiles, different from Calder's in that they were lighter, feminine, and made not of metal, but of wood strips with insets of paper. Perhaps encouraged by Ernst and Duchamp, Levy decided to give the first solo showing of Cage's latest constructions. Julien and Xenia designed a clever single sheet catalog that doubled as a template for a do it yourself mobile. Cage's exhibition went on view in December 1943, consisting of 11 mobiles, which Levy would later describe as abstractions of the marriage between a kite and a canoe. Dorothea Tanning had been working as a commercial artist when Julien came to her apartment sometime in late 1941 or early 1942. Impressed with the 2.5 paintings she showed him, he immediately offered her an exhibition as soon as she had completed enough canvases. Years later, Tanning reflected on how she had looked forward to displaying her paintings in his gallery. Of all the gallery activity on 57th Street, where everything happened in those days, it was the Julien Levy Gallery that was truly making art history, the place where it was at. The prospect of seeing one's own work on its walls was breathtaking. In the late spring of 1942, Levy invited Tanning to a cocktail party at his apartment, where she was introduced to Max Ernst. Unhappily married to Peggy Guggenheim, Ernst was fascinated by Tanning, and within a few months, they began an affair. The couple spent the summer of 1943 in Arizona, and on April 1st, 1944, Tanning's long-awaited solo exhibition opened at the Levy Gallery. Tanning's catalog featured a drawing reflecting the topography of Sedona on the cover, and Ernst, whose show at the gallery opened 3 weeks later, wrote an admiring introductory essay. Among the 20 canvases on view was portrait of Muriel Levy, Julien's second wife, painted by Tanning in 1943. In fact, this was really a double portrait in which Muriel's head appeared partially enveloped by a billowy, transparent membrane that echoed the shape of Julien Levy's profile. Tanning's second exhibition at the Levy Gallery opened on January 6, 1948, and the reviews were stunningly positive. Art News described Tanning as one of the most gifted young surrealists. Miss Tanning's visions are personal and real. They speak of the child's lost safety and an adult's open terrors. No less impressive, though in a more playful mood, are such small pictures as Max in a Blue Boat, a charming portrait in a bright fairyland. Soon after her marriage to painter Earl Miller in 1935, Henrietta Myers began signing her work using the name Peter Miller, as she was convinced that collectors would take her paintings more seriously if they thought a man had created them. Her first solo exhibition in New York City opened at the Levy Gallery in May 1944, and many of her paintings were based on the design motifs used by the Native Americans who lived in Miller's beloved San Ildefonso Pueblo near Santa Fe, New Mexico. Levy mounted a second showing of Miller's work in October 1945, and the critic at Art News reported, Peter Miller, perhaps the only painter who has combined the imagery of Miro and the art concepts of American Indian sand painting, is offering her recent canvases at the Julien Levy Gallery, and most of them show her developing a more immediate expressiveness. Catherine Lynn Sage, known as Kay, met artist Yves Tanguy in Paris in 1938, and they fled to New York City in 1939 due to the threat of war in Europe. Recognizing Sage's aesthetic progress since her return to the US, Julian decided to show her work in October 1944. The 18 works displayed were stark and refined, and the reviews were positive, but virtually all of them emphasized Sage's marriage to Tanguy instead of her talent as a painter. In October 1947, Sage's second exhibition at the Levy Gallery went on view, consisting of 11 oils, all completed during the past year. Her Ring of Iron, Ring of Wool was one of the first examples of her new approach to painting, with its lack of figural elements and its off-kilter umbrella-like structures. In 1955, Yves Tanguy died suddenly after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage. Sage ended her life in January 1963, but left behind several notes written in her ironic style. One explained her suicide as the means by which she sought to attain her ultimate destiny. The first painting by Yves that I saw before I knew him was called I'm Waiting for You. This kills me. Now he's waiting for me again. I'm on my way. In late November 1947, Julien mounted a solo exhibition of Maria Martins' sculptures. Martins, who went by the mononym Maria, was then married to the Brazilian ambassador to the United States. When her art dealer, Valentine de Densing, unexpectedly closed his gallery in the spring of 1947, she needed another venue to show her latest work. During the past few years, Maria had been involved in an intense affair with Duchamp, so he might have approached Levy on her behalf. Many of Maria's works were inspired by the Amazonian gods and goddesses who purportedly inhabit the Brazilian rainforest. One critic enthused, in this show, Maria has a far more forceful expression than ever. No other sculptress is at once so much female and so little feminine. Mosaicist Jean Renault's first solo exhibition in New York City opened at the Levy Gallery in late October 1948. Appropriately, it was scheduled to partially coincide with a memorial exhibition for her close friend Arshile Gorky. Included were 16 mosaics, and the show received positive attention from the press. Levy chose one of the mosaics for himself, which he would display in his Connecticut home until his death in 1981. In conclusion, to fully appreciate Julien Levy's ability to recognize talent whenever and wherever he saw it, it is important to remember that most of the artists who made their American art world debuts at the Julien Levy Gallery were not well known in the United States at the time, but would eventually comprise an amazing roster of names that few art dealers could ever hope to equal. During the 18 years his gallery was active, Julien Levy displayed all forms of art by all sorts of people. His tastes were tantalizingly diverse, his motivations mostly altruistic, his aspirations limited only by his own shortcomings. The range of his accomplishments looms large within the art historical period, and future exhibitions featuring the artists he championed will only grow in number. I'm sure I'm close to the end of my allotted time, so if you have questions, please find me during the breaks, and I will be happy to talk to you.